Zimbabwe cash crisis worse.
Talking about Venezuela once again.
Systemic important banks. They removed the one factor you do this thing they're called monetary awareness.
Next recession.
Recession will be
Will be a recession.
We're going to hit a recession.
The date of the next recession.
a U.S.-only recession typically lasts 8 to 10 months, but a lot of things about this particular one have not been typical. So
A crash is coming now, whether it's 6 months from now, 12 months, 36 months, no one knows.
I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. If you know what to do, if you have the right plan to set up, you can make a lot of money from this.
Hey there, hope all is well. Back at you today with some more RT News updates. And as you can tell from today's title, all indicators pointing to higher inflation, I'm going to share with you some recent commentary by the bond fund king, Jeffrey Gundlach, and how he feels that we are at a tipping point and that 2019 will be the year that everything is unleashed. And so before I dive into those articles today, I want to encourage you to tune in tonight for the RTD live talk starting at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. We're going to talk about various subjects such as the cryptos, metals, as well as the economy, and whatever else is on your mind. So join me tonight at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. Make sure you subscribe, click the notification tab to be informed when we go live. As always, I want to encourage you to click the subscribe button for more RT news as well as updates, as well as make sure you hit that notification tab to be informed of all future interviews as well as news updates. But more importantly, if you do the RTD, I want to encourage you to visit the RTD University page, where I put together all my prior interviews dealing with monetary matters, banking, finance, and the importance of having precious metals in your possession today. So let's dive into today's articles. So as I mentioned, I have a couple articles dealing with the whole idea of inflation rising higher and how I believe it's very important when billionaire gentlemen become very vocal on how dangerous the markets are. I think it's worth taking note of because these people live in the markets. They study all types of data and analytics around the world on how to make money for their holders as well as for themselves. So when they say they are alarmed or spooked, I think it's definitely worth paying attention to. And then one thing that's really alarming is the idea that the Federal Reserve is always screaming about needing to reaching their inflation target of 2%. And so right now they're around that 2% mark, but yet they're still concerned over the fact that the 2% may not be high enough because there's so much volatility in the market, as well as so many policies that have been very questionable with the fact that they're trying to hike interest rates while also unloading their balance sheet. There's so many factors in understanding how this economy works that it's very worthwhile understanding what the whole CPI, which are designed to give you an idea of what inflation really is, but yet at the end of the day, those marks, in my opinion, are well below the true inflation rate, which you and I feel in our pockets when we go to the grocery stores as well as our everyday living. And as always, before I dive into today's articles, I want to encourage you to take the time for yourself to read some of these articles to get a better understanding of what's actually going on. My goal is to just skim the surface, give you something to think about, and at the very end, share with you my opinion on how this is a very important matter that we all should really be paying attention to more closely. So let's dive into today's articles. So here we have the first article here from Business Insider. It's from Gundlach. It says, "We're at a moment of truth that could break either way." This article here is stemming from some comments he made from a recent conference held down at the Strategic Investments Conference. And just giving an idea of who this gentleman is, it says, Jeff Gundlach from Double Line Capital said that we're at a moment of truth that could break either way. So now is the time to have high conviction about the economy or markets. It says, showing a chart of the U.S. budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, Gundlach warned investors about rising deficit without a recession. The deficit, combined with the Fed's balance sheet roll-off, which means 2 to 3 trillion in new Treasury issuance, says Gundlach thinks this situation is set to explode in 2019. Next, he goes on to say that all indicators point to higher inflation. It says later Gundlach moved on to inflation. He said there are two key parts of inflation: core services and core good. And there's a big disparity between the two in the U.S. However, the core CPI in the U.S. is trending up. We're also seeing rising inflation in Germany and Japan. Says further, Gundlach pointed out that there is a high correlation between core CPI and future GDP. It says, bottom line, all of Gundlach's indicators point to higher inflation. He says he finds it comical that the Fed has been trying to get 2% inflation, yet we are already there. So if inflation goes higher, the question is not how it affects the economy, it's how the markets will react. And so here, as he mentioned here, the fact that we're already around the 2% inflation target that the Federal Reserve feels is the best for the economy, but yet there's still so much talk about how inflation is still not quite there yet, and then unemployment numbers aren't there yet. So all the measurements they're using to come up with this bogus statistic of inflation rate, it's starting to fall apart at the seams because the people aren't buying it and the markets are reacting to it. And so it's just a matter of time before this 2% inflation rate is either hiked up to something a little bit more reasonable, like 3 or 4%, to give them a little bit more leeway to try to pump this narrative of we need more inflation, or they're going to exceed the 2% number by measurements that we haven't seen since the 1970s when it was about 10% or so. And at that point, that's when you and I will really begin feeling a pinch in our pockets as it becomes obvious that the cost of our daily lives is going up rapidly, more so than our pay. So that's just the thoughts of this billionaire hedge fund manager here. Let's move on to another article. Here's an article here from Gains, Pains, and Capital, and it says, warning, last week's wage data confirms inflation is spiking. So to give you an idea what's going on here, it says inflation is now reaching a crescendo. The fact is that inflation developed in stages in the economy. The first stage concerns the price of items being bought and sold by wholesalers. We saw this begin to surge starting in the middle of last year, and it was a global phenomenon. It says paying more for something is manageable for a while. However, at some point, the increase in prices is passed on into the economy in the form of more expensive goods and services. This is when inflation truly begins to become a problem. And the telltale sign that things are beginning to get out of control is when workers begin demanding higher wages to deal with the increased cost of living. We are now officially there. Last week's job data revealed that average hourly earnings for some 80% of workers rose at an annualized pace of 3% over the last 3 months. He says, again, this was over 3 months, so it's not a single data point. It says workers are demanding higher wages to deal with the higher cost of living. So here we have in this article here the idea that inflation is already here, and it shows up in the signs that more people are demanding a higher wages in their pay because the cost of living is going up. So that in and of itself lets you know that this 2% in target rate is not really what it's all cracked up to be, because in actuality, we're already beyond that 2% mark that the Federal Reserve is trying to maintain when it comes to spending in our pockets. So next one. So the next one here is from Zero Hedge, and it says consumer prices accelerate as apparel, car insurance jumps. So here it gives a lot of great graphs and statistics to let you know that this 2% inflation target that the Fed is supposedly trying to reach is bogus. And so if you're interested here, feel free to read some of this information for yourself, but definitely some good graphs worth studying. So here we have the next article from Bloomberg, and it says central banks are looking for new ways to meet inflation targets. So this article here covers a variety of countries around this planet and how the central banks are dealing with the idea that they're not reaching their targets. And so they're trying to experiment with new ways of hitting their targets. And it's quite interesting how every country has a different way in which they're looking to do that. So to give an idea of what's going on here, it says the Federal Reserve officials have been talking about operating regimes for years, and the discussion continues as the central bank struggles to reach its 2% inflation target, which it has missed for most of the past 5 years. It says core consumer price gains came in at 1.8% in February from a year earlier. It says in January, a couple Fed officials discussed expressing the inflation target as a range instead of a point estimate, while others suggested the policy committee examine price level targeting. Meeting minutes show. It says price level targeting has support from John Williams, president of the San Francisco Fed, who in November has called it a powerful way to cope with the zero lower bound. Any change to the 2% target would draw scrutiny from Congress, says Fed Chairman Jerome Powell was questioned on the topic at a monetary policy hearing last month. He was quoted saying, "I would say that the framework is working," he told the House Financial Services Committee. So here you have the idea that the 2% target is what is ideal, but yet because they're not achieving it as fast as they would like, they're going to look to change how they actually calculate their target by shifting from a consumer basket of goods pricing to actually price targeting certain items as a way of keeping measurement. And so there you have the idea that they're experimenting on the fly, trying to figure this thing out as thing goes along. So this is just more information into this whole monetary experiment that we're a part of, and how these people at the Federal Reserve really have no clue as to how this is going to unravel, other than the fact that more debt will be created and more people will become aware of the problems they created as their disposable income erodes away and the purchasing power of that dollar diminishes completely. So more information there if you're interested in reading for yourself. So the very last article here is from Business Insider, and it's an older article, but it gives an idea of the breakdown of how the whole CPI PCE or 2% inflation target by the Federal Reserve is actually calculated. And it has to do with the idea that over the last 20 or 30 years, ever since we left the gold standard, especially in the 70s when inflation spiked up, it looks like around 1982 or so, the Bureau of Labor Statistics changed the calculation of the CPI altogether by removing a couple items that's very important to understanding how the true cost should be measured. And so since that time, the CPI in of itself, as you can see here, is measured with food, shelter, other housing, apparel, transportation, medical care. So the CPI has been typical up until 2000 when Alan Greenspan decided to shift away from using the CPI solely until using the PCE. And so the PCE is the personal consumption expenditures, which at this particular time, it always came in a little bit less in regards to the inflation rate than the CPI. And say for example here, during this whole article here, it says that in May of 2014, based upon a CPI measurement, inflation was at 2.1%. But when you use the CP or the PCE as a way of measuring it, it was at 1.6. So if you look closely at some of these measurements here, the biggest one here is shelter. So basically the cost of housing and renting and things like that, how prior to 2000 or around 2000, it made up about 31% of the whole calculation. Whereas under the PCE, it's cut in half to 15, as if saying that shelter is not a major expenditure for us consumers. And then if you go look around the graph here, we have at 16, we have education and other goods. So other goods is a 16% of the PCE, whereas according to CPI, it's only 3%. So that's another major difference. And then you have over here in gray, you have the medical care. For under PCE, the expenditures for medical care is a major chunk of that, whereas in over here, it's only 7%. So here you have the idea that the whole method in measuring inflation is skewed in the fact that the CPI contains the actual cost that I have to spend when it comes to being alive and living and sustaining myself, whereas in the PCE is based upon the expenditures of goods and services. So those are two key distinctions there. That's the reason why this whole 2% inflation target is bogus, because in actuality, we're well beyond 2% if you look at the actual cost of housing going up, rents going up, you got food, and then also you factor in just the small details of our lives, such as medical care, schooling, and things like that. So those are all factors that play into this whole idea that the 2% inflation rate is bogus. So when this gentleman here speaks of the fact that inflation is spiking and that it's things that alarm him, it lets me know that we are well beyond 2% and that it's just a matter of time before it really shows up in the markets when there's some type of downturn. And then you factor in the deficit spending by our government and how they're about to issue so much more debt to fund this infrastructure as well as this tax reform plan. So in the future, prices will go up. So I believe that right now is probably the cheapest it will be this year. And so that's good to say that as year goes on, it's going to become more expensive. It's going to be more obvious and evident to where he won't be able to lie with these articles here saying that 2% inflation is the target that the Fed is trying to achieve. So that's what's happening in the news. I would love to hear your thoughts on this whole matter. Leave me a comment down below. And other than that, I hope you can join me tonight at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time to talk about issues such as this, as well as whatever else is on your mind. Other than that, I want you to enjoy your day. Thanks.